Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's event. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that you can stay up to date with everything that's happening here in the Stacks by following us on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and other social media platforms. By going on pals.com/events, you can find out who's gracing us with their presence in the upcoming weeks. Some exciting events we have coming up include Annie Hartnett, Ocean Vaughn, Emily St. John Mandel, and so many more. When looking for future events, please note whether the event requires a Zoom login or actually lists a store location, because we have resumed in-store events as of last month, actually at the beginning of this month, actually. And I would hate to see you be disappointed. Tonight, we're excited to welcome Theresa Brown to Powell's. Theresa Brown, RN, author of the New York Times bestseller, The Shift, has been a contributor to the New York Times and New York Times. Her writing appears on CNN.com and in the American Journal of Nursing, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. She lectures nationally and internationally on issues related to nursing, healthcare, and end-of-life care. Theresa is here to discuss her newest book, Healing: When a Nurse Becomes a Patient. When a Nurse Becomes a Patient tells a poignant, powerful, and intensely personal story about breast cancer. Theresa brings us along with her from the mammogram that would change her life through her diagnosis, treatment, and recovery. Despite her training and years of experience as an oncology and hospice nurse, she finds herself continually surprised by the lack of compassion in the medical maze, just as so many of us have been. Why is she expected to wait over a long weekend to hear the results of her cancer tests if they are already ready? Where is the empathy from caregivers? Why is she so often left in the dark about procedures and treatments? At times, she's mad at herself for not speaking up and asking for what she needs, but knows that being labeled a difficult patient could mean she receives worse care. As she did in her book, The Shift, Brown draws us into the work with unforgettable details of her daily life, the needles, the chemo drugs, the rubber gloves, the frustrated patients. But from her new perch as a patient, she also takes a look back on with rare candor at some of her own cases as a nurse and considers what she didn't know then and what she could have done better. Theresa will be joined in conversation by Gabriel Winant. Gabriel is assistant professor of history at the University of Chicago. He is the author of The Next Shift: The Fall of Industry and the Rise of Healthcare in the Rust Belt America. Tonight's event will include a Q&A, so please put your questions for Gabriel and Theresa inside the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, so Gabriel's able to find them a lot easier instead of throughout the chat. Throughout the event, I'll be posting a link to both Theresa and Gabriel's books, along with any other books that they mention as resources. Please consider supporting the authors and pals by clicking the links in the chat to complete your order. Now, please welcome Theresa Brown and Gabriel Winant.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's really a thrill to be at Powell's. I was there in person a few years ago, and it's just an amazing bookstore. So I'm, as I said to them, a little bit verklempt at doing this event, and thank you all for being here. So this is my book, as you saw, and it's a series of short chapters, many of which alternate between stories of my diagnosis of breast cancer and treatment for it, and stories of being a nurse. This chapter called Balance, which starts the second part of the book, which is called Nurse Brown MIA, so missing in action, a feeling that I had lost touch with my whole nurse self, but that's the chapter I'm going to read from. So chapter 12, Balance. This was the moment of the seesaw. The balance tipped from nurse to patient. Remember seesaws? They've disappeared from playgrounds. But seesaws gave valuable lessons in cooperation and the temptations of raw power. And what I mean by that is obviously the going up and down with a friend, but how two people or three people could come and sit on one end and hold you up in the air if they wanted to. A cancer diagnosis is, in its own way, a seesaw, and maybe also a bully, the same as those kids on the playground who would sit on one end. One of the last patients I visited before being diagnosed with cancer myself was a woman on home hospice with breast cancer. She lived in one of Pittsburgh's historically Black, low-income neighborhoods. The husband of one of our new nurses had supposedly forbade her from caring for patients in that neighborhood. Forbade. Even without the sexism in the husband's pronouncement, the word sounds like an ancient prohibition. In truth, Pittsburgh crime statistics do show a not insignificant rate of violent crime for that neighborhood, and the husband's attitude reflected an even larger societal problem of poverty being linked with crime. But the ideal in healthcare is we treat all comers and we treat them the same no matter where they live. That's one definition of compassion. In the US, though, we absolutely do not treat all patients the same. For example, inability to pay is a known limit on access to care, enforced by insurance companies and hospitals alike, and is also structurally supported as a hard stop on care availability, except for those poor enough to qualify for Medicaid or those over 65 who qualify for Medicare. Our nurse's husband may have been worried about his wife's safety, or he may have had racist ideas, or both. But the truth is, equal care is already denied many people of color, sometimes because they can't pay, yes, but sometimes only because they are not white. Cancer treatment specifically is unequal for Black Americans, according to the American Cancer Society. Black people have the highest death rate and shortest survival of any racial group for most cancers in the US. So now I'm going back to the patient I said I had been to see. I had been this patient's nurse maybe a month before, and my hope is on that day for that patient, the care I gave was the same care I would have given anyone else. The patient had moved into her daughter's small 2-story house, and they put her hospital bed in the first floor living room. I remembered her because when I saw her 1 month previously, she had refused all pain medication despite obviously being in pain. That first time when I came to the house, the patient wouldn't meet my eye as I asked about her pain and said the medications we offered could help. Her daughter came down the stairs and hinted that I should keep the visit short. When I checked in a month later, though, the patient was transformed. She sat up straight in the hospital bed and looked right at me. Her white hair was combed back from her smiling face, and she told me she had no pain at all. A small miracle of persistence and persuasion. She had started taking pain medication. When I'd finished the visit, as I got ready to leave by putting my stethoscope, thermometer, and blood pressure cuff into my bag, the patient told me, "I'm going to beat this. I've just got too much living to do." She looked out the window at the street outside and then back at me. "I've got grandchildren, you know." I paused. Another seesaw, truth versus denial. Was this why she now took pain medication? Did she believe that she would survive her untreatable metastatic breast cancer? Hospice work demands scrupulous honesty about life and death. But this time, for once, I hedged, tacitly supporting her denial. "Well, why not?" I told her. Then I smiled and waved as I left the house. Why not? Why not? This woman dying of breast cancer is the last work memory I have prior to my own diagnosis. The specialized knowledge that comes from working in healthcare can feel like power, is power, when a patient doesn't comprehend the likely outcome, but we do. And that's part of why none of us wants to be in the hospital bed instead of standing next to it in scrubs. But figuratively, I was in a hospital bed. I'd somehow gotten on the wrong side of the seesaw. My balance was off. Modern healthcare saved me, saved my life, but Theresa, the person, got lost. We discuss physical failure and healthcare in terms like decompensation, morbidity and mortality, multiple organ dysfunction syndrome, and the patient ceased to breathe. But what about the soul, or whatever one calls that singular essence that makes each of us who we are? That needs tending too. All I wanted after my diagnosis was for someone involved in treating my cancer to sit down with me, look me in the eye, and explain my diagnosis, discuss what my prognosis looked like, and clarify my likely course of treatment. That's it. Simple, easy, never happened. Another fulcrum, the separation in healthcare of patient and person, body and soul. That is failure. And when I felt this failure, felt it hurting me over and over again, I knew that it was also my failure as a nurse. It is a failure of compassion, which is not surprising since over the past few decades, healthcare has changed from people-centered to profit-centered. Diagnosis-related groups and the International Classification of Diseases 10th Revision billing codes do not address a clinical lack of compassion, but slighting the human in patients and clinicians alike shows we've got the balance wrong. Can we try again? Why not? People failed me when I was a patient, and I failed patients when working as a nurse. I see that now. People also came through for me, and as a nurse, I did my best for patients. But the overall balance between profit and compassionate care is off. It has tipped too far towards profit, meaning playground bullies control the seesaw. Consider that more than 25 million Americans lack health insurance. Medical mistakes are one of the leading causes of death in the United States. Life expectancy in the US is going down, not up. These data points show how little patient well-being matters relative to the money-hungry healthcare machine. We can try, though, to restore the balance, to find that synergy in the seesaw by caring equally for all patients, by treating the body and the soul. Hi, Gabe.
Hi, Theresa. Maybe I'll jump in here for a moment. So I'm tonight's moderator, I guess. And first of all, let me say thanks to Powell Books for hosting us. I too haven't been there in a few years, but think of it very, very fondly. And thank you, Theresa, for this wonderful book, which I found really moving and powerful, and touch on all different kinds of things that I have thought a lot about and felt a lot about in many parts of my life. And I think that's sort of where I wanted to start the discussion. So I thought basically I would sort of ask you a few questions and let you just either speak from the book or expand or elaborate on the book in whatever way you choose, and then we'll have a little time at the end for Q&A. But just thinking about where you just started us off, I mean, it's so, one of the things I think is so striking about this book is how the healthcare system is so paradoxical in so many ways. And one of them is that it's so big, right? It seems to have so much capacity. It seems to be kind of taking over the world, even it's so big. And yet at the same time, it's so hard to find a little piece of it for oneself as a patient, I think. And it's so kind of miraculous in many ways in what it can do, and yet at the same time, so often so intensely dehumanizing feeling. And those are very strange contradictions, I think, in our healthcare system that your book is sort of perfectly designed to bring out and explore in the way that you kind of cross the boundary in the book, and that's really what the book is about. So one good way into that, I thought, would be to ask you a question that I've thought a lot about, wondered a lot about myself, and thinking about healthcare, which is about time. Healthcare, it has always seemed to me is something that we really have to kind of think about and relate to in the medium of the lived time of the body in various ways. And if you just think about, any kind of treatment, course of treatment, right? All of the kind of cycles of time that are part of it in terms of prognosis and prescription and so on. Healthcare, being a nurse, working in healthcare also is structured in time in many complex ways, it seems to me. And so I wanted to just kind of invite you to think a little bit about your experiences of time as a nurse and as a patient, and to compare them with each other for us, and think about how time flowed differently or similarly for you across both sides of that divide.
Wow, that is such a great and fun question. Because as a nurse, your whole life is time. It can be hours, it can be minutes. I started blood on a transfusion for someone, and in 15 minutes, I need to be in there to recheck their vital signs, or I need to give this chemotherapy drug over 20 minutes. And there is so much about time as a nurse as this ruling force of all of our lives. And there's never any time to eat. Sometimes there's not time to sit down. During COVID, you heard nurses saying, I have no time to go to the bathroom. So it's all about time and feeling that it rules really everything that we do. So when I became a patient, I knew that, right? And I talk about this in healing when I went for a biopsy. So an ultrasound diagnosed my breast cancer, a follow-up ultrasound with a mammogram. But then you have to have a biopsy to actually get a diagnosis of cancer. They have to look at the tissue and see if there are actually cancer cells there. So we needed to have 2 biopsies, different reasons. And the first one is you lie on a table and you actually have your breasts hang through this hole in the table, which sounds, like you're a car in a garage, and that's how it feels. And they couldn't get the sample they wanted, and they kept saying, hold still, and can you sort of micro move this way and that way? And I knew that the most important thing for me in that situation was to do what they told me, to move when they told me, to not move when they told me, to not complain, to not ask questions, because that's going to make it as easy as possible for them to do their jobs. And people need to really think of healthcare as this giant assembly line, which is a sort of horrible image, right? But just go with me for a minute, this giant assembly line. And that assembly line needs to keep moving because there are so many moving parts. So my biopsy ended up taking a lot longer than they thought it would. Now that means some other people's biopsies probably got put off, or they're going to have to be hurried into a different room to have their biopsy. It makes everything complicated. And I know how important it is not to, in a sense, throw a wrench into the works, right? To be compliant. But after that biopsy and the second biopsy, I had really had it. I had had it with people looking at my breast, poking me, not telling me what was going on. And I realized what a cost there is to being that patient who just does whatever you're told because that's what you need to do for healthcare to happen. So your question just brings up this fascinating dichotomy I hadn't thought about before, where I felt like to be a patient, I need to have no sense of time. The time needs to be the hospital's because I was a nurse. But as a patient, I wanted my time. I wanted someone to hold my hand. I wanted them to tell me what was going on. I wanted them to tell me, hey, we're going to stick a needle in your breast. Oh, we didn't get the sample. Okay, now we're going to do that again. We're going to do that again and do that again. And yeah, there needs to be time for that, I think. Great thing to think about.
Yeah, I want to ask a follow-up question about that. Can you think of a time when you feel like as a patient, you were able to get someone to go slow for you in the way that you wanted, or maybe to hurry up for you, right? That also happens in healthcare where you're like, God, how long is this going to take? I'm curious if you would to tell us about moments when you felt like you had, maybe had some agency over the flow of time. And I understand what you're saying about, your own kind of like desire to be compliant and not to gum up the works. But I imagine there were moments where also your humanity kind of came through.
Yeah, this may sound a little bit sad, but I think all these lessons had really sunk in when I had finished treatment. And it's a long medical story that's not that interesting about, I'd been on the drug tamoxifen and then I went off it, and how were we going to manage things? But in that moment for these questions, I actually ended up getting a new medical oncologist. And with this medical oncologist and his staff, I really insisted on understanding everything, on getting the answers. So this whole experience of being a patient, and in particular being on tamoxifen, which a lot of women take after they have breast cancer, which was just a terrible drug for me. And I didn't realize how terrible it was till I stopped taking it. And then I wonder if I had complained more, would the oncologist have heard me? I don't know. I was complaining some, and it seemed like it just wasn't registering. But so with this new doctor and the PA he works with and the nurse on his staff, I was really politely insistent, which is what I encourage patients to be. And they took time, they returned my phone calls, they were very clear. They let me insist on understanding, and they made sure that I understood. And they even said, "We want you to understand," which was great.
I'd be curious also to hear if you have reflections on your practice as a nurse from that angle, either thinking about, moments before your diagnosis where you, wish you had kind of seen things differently or paced things differently, or just sort of lessons that you took from that experience, again, in terms of, fast and slow and opportunities to reflect, and, when patients kind of generate some friction or resistance, how you relate to that. Because I think these are really, tricky questions that lots of us have experienced in one form or another, actually.
Yeah, right. And there was a moment when I realized, oh, I am the difficult patient, what in healthcare we call the difficult patient, which often means the patient who really insists on understanding and speaking up, not being abusive, but just saying, wait, I'm putting a wrench in the works because I don't get where this assembly line is taking me. And that was, I'll be honest, an embarrassing moment. And then I thought, well, I don't know, this is kind of what it took to be the difficult patient. But I'm remembering a story that also made its way into the book about a patient we had who came in for supplemental chemotherapy. So he'd done his first main big round for his leukemia, but came in for, a couple nights and days. He would get follow-up chemo. He'd started early in the day at the outpatient clinic across the street. And the whole idea was, we're going to get these patients in, we're going to get them ready across the street. They're going to come to the hospital, bam, everything's going to go just like that, right? Well, he was supposed to start on IV fluids, but he didn't start on IV fluids and didn't have an IV pump. That happens. Okay. So I call supply. Oh, I need an IV pump. We don't have any IV pumps. And people should understand, this is like a restaurant saying, we're out of cloth napkins. We don't have any forks. Like, that just doesn't happen, right? That a hospital just runs out of IV pumps. But they ran out of IV pumps. And I had 3 other patients. I was busy that day, but also, and I am honest about this, in healing, he was really angry, this patient, and he would look out the door of his room at me and give me dirty looks. And it was hard to take. And because I was busy, I think because I was annoyed at the outpatient clinic, because I didn't know what was going on in the supply room, I didn't move heaven and earth to try and find an IV pump. And I would do that for patients. And I talk about a time in the book when I did do that, but I didn't do that for him. I didn't have it in me that day. And once I became a patient, I looked back on that and I thought, that must have been so awful for him. He comes in early. He's told, hey, we have this new routine. We're going to get you in and out early, and it's going to be great. And then he goes to the hospital and he sits in his room literally for hours. And his nurse, who can't seem to give him the time of day, tells him it's because the hospital is out of IV pumps, which seems ridiculous. And I imagined him thinking, what do I have to do here to get my chemo? Bring my own IV pump? And how his trust must have been so broken. And so what I would tax myself to do as a nurse in the future would be to try and think about how that feels for that person. And when I went back to home hospice after my treatment was done, I was much better able to do that. I really could understand so much better the feelings people were probably having, the need they had to feel connection but also just to have things work. Like, could things just please work so I can get the healthcare that I need?
That tees up very nicely the next question I wanted to ask you. I think one interesting thing about nursing in general, and that I think, again, your book brings out really well, and even your answer just now kind of brings out really well, is this tension about how much of yourself you can give. And, I think in some ways we expect lots of care workers and care providers of all kinds, and particularly women care providers, to have a kind of bottomless reservoir, right? And in some ways, even the answer you just gave, you're saying, well, I should have, I wish I had kind of been able to give this, to move heaven and earth for this patient. And of course, obviously, we all understand why. And we all would like to be the person who can do that. But there are limits also, of course, for any person in any profession in the course of your day. And so I'm curious about, especially since you've been back working in home hospice, how you think about, your own limits, and how you kind of manage the question of how much of yourself you want to mobilize and draw on and give and spend, or if that's the wrong way to think about it, maybe, right? Maybe it's not a kind of finite quantity that you spend down, but I'm curious about those kind of inner resources that you draw on, and how you ration them or manage them.
Yeah, that's so important. And as I'm sure everyone knows, that question took on national importance during COVID, right? Because you saw nurses and doctors working these incredibly long shifts, shift after shift after shift, never enough people, no time to eat, no time to go to the bathroom, constantly wearing layers and layers of PPE. And before we had vaccines, worried that they might get a disease that would kill them or their entire family. That is a lot. That is a lot to put on anyone. And we put it on thousands of healthcare workers all over this country. And we found out a lot of people couldn't take it, right? And I don't mean that at all in a pejorative way. I mean it as an observation that everyone has limits. And that's really what I came back to work with, is my sense of my own limits. So paradoxically, I felt more able to give emotionally and to be in the moment with patients, but I was much less willing to kind of knock myself out, feeling like, well, the system kind of gives 50%. So if I give 120%, that's kind of close to 100%. I just felt like I can't do that anymore. And in part because as a patient, I saw those people who care and work so hard, giving 120% still does not make up for the failures of the system, which is hard to see and admit, but it made me much better at taking care of myself. And people have asked me, what advice would you give nurses after COVID? And I say, paradoxically, I would say, look out for yourself. If your floor is short and you feel like you can't go to work, don't go to work when they call you. Don't agree to work 16 hours instead of 12. Make sure you eat. Take time to be a human being, because otherwise you're not going to be able to do the job. So I have this vision of a COVID reset where we're going to have to find a way to have a healthcare system that values the people providing the care and also values workers. And I love this quotation I read by a doctor who was doing volunteer mental health care with physicians during COVID, who said, you don't have to light yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. And I think so many of us in healthcare, that's what we do. We're ready. We are ready with the match. We are ready to light ourselves on fire. And it's just not necessary. So this whole kind of hero narrative, and I'm going to save the day, we need to replace it with something that's much more humane and honors the fact that none of us are invulnerable.
Sorry.
Okay.
That's a really wise answer. It makes me want to bring up, I was going to ask this question later, but I'll ask you now about COVID, and thinking about the experience of the pandemic and the aftermath, not that it's over, of the pandemic, but whatever future we're moving into. And the book is not about health policy, really. It's much more personal than that. But I know that you have thoughts and ideas about health policy, and I wonder if you could kind of combine those in some way, like your personal kind of experience and journey, from your professional life through your quite harrowing experience of breast cancer, and then this kind of harrowing experience that we collectively have had, which is of a different kind, but is also, a major kind of brush with mortality collectively. Putting those things together, and building on what you were just saying about, valuing caregivers in a different kind of way, what would you like to see changed about nursing in particular?
Yeah, I would love to have a healthcare environment that truly sees the value of nurses. And this became a true literal economic question during the pandemic, with so many nurses either leaving their jobs or leaving their jobs to become travel nurses. If people haven't read about this, there have always been travel nurses, but it started out as a lot of nurses, say, went to New York when New York was overwhelmed with COVID. And travel nurses tend to make 3 to 5 times what bedside nurses do. And then people started traveling all over. Wherever there was a COVID hotspot, people would travel to. And then other nurses realized, wow, I'm doing the same job as this travel nurse, and they're making 5 times what I'm making. So now the travel agencies say they're seeing nurses in all fields who are leaving their jobs in neonatal intensive care or orthopedics or just regular med surg, and they're becoming travel nurses in those same fields. And some travel nurses have even left their jobs, become travelers, come back to their same jobs in their same hospital as a traveler. So they're doing the same job, but they're making 5 times as much money. And this is not economically sustainable. But why this is happening, and you and I talked about this a little bit, is that nurses are a labor cost for hospitals, the biggest labor cost of any hospital. And so when hospitals think about cutting costs, they think about getting rid of nurses. The problem with this is you can only stretch someone so far, as we just talked about. Everyone has a breaking point. So what I want to see is not necessarily a hospital system where all nurses make 5 times what they're making now. I mean, I'm sure everyone would love that, but I think what we need, and also what would make a huge difference for people, is an environment where nurses are valued in terms of always having enough staff, having a float pool that has flexibility. So if a nurse calls off sick, there's someone who can take that nurse's place. A sense of someone would be able to come help you if you're suddenly overwhelmed with what you have to do on the floor. And there's so much nimbleness that's required in modern healthcare. Patients are much sicker than they used to be. The needs can ratchet up very quickly. People have shorter and shorter hospital stays, so a lot has to happen during the time that they're in the hospital. And nurses are so much a part of that. So that needs to be recognized and valued. That's my fantasy. And people have been talking about the same things for years, but again, we've reached a point where we're saying there are not enough nurses. There are hospitals canceling surgeries because they don't have enough nurses. There are ERs that can't take in patients because they don't have enough nurses. And it's interesting, this gets talked about as beds. We don't have the beds, but nurses on Twitter keep saying, this is not about beds, this is about nurses. It's not having enough nurses. So I really would like our importance to be seen, that we're not sort of glorified waitresses who help doctors with their work. We have our own training, our own set of responsibilities. We're the first alert system in the hospital, all those things. And to tag on to that, most people who go into healthcare, I think, are really caring. They want to do right by patients. And we're in a system, though, that increasingly just wants everything to keep moving, because then you can bill more and make more money. And I think you can have a system that moves, but it also has to be able to adapt to people being sad, people being afraid, people having questions, people wanting to understand the most basic thing of all. And we don't have that now.
Yeah, I think, that's something that your book really, and all of your writing really, I think brings out really powerfully. And the point you're making about beds versus nurses, I think is so key in particular, right? That we tend to think of the healthcare system as like fixed assets. And it sort of sounds like a cliche to say it, but what it really is people. And I think that's really needs to be much more front and center in that conversation. It was amazing to me when a few months ago, Congress, a bipartisan coalition in Congress, was talking about imposing a federal cap on
Yes.
nurse salaries. And that's not to say that, as you point out, the travel nurse issue is not a major economic problem for hospitals. It is, but what other line of work do you ever hear Congress talking about capping its salary? I mean, certainly not like hospital CEOs, for example.
Right, or hedge fund managers.
Right. Yeah. Okay, I have a couple other questions I want to ask you, but in about 7 or 8 minutes, I think we should go to Q&A from the audience also. So let me remind audience members to please put your questions in the Q&A form at the bottom. We have a few there already, but I'll just re-invite you to do that. I want to ask you about your relationship with mortality and thinking about mortality and the ways that you kind of navigated it in multiple roles as a home hospice nurse and also as someone who obviously had this brush with mortality. And, I don't think that anyone ever finds total peace and that has exactly the right thing to say about the inevitability of death. But, I think it's obviously, as we've been talking about, it's the presence of mortality in everyday life. It has felt heightened for all of us, I think, in some form over the last couple of years. And I'm sure almost everyone has someone close to them who they're, I know I do, especially scared for about COVID, or has lost people already. And so, I think this kind of fundamental feature of human experience has in some way been kind of amped up for all of us. And I think your book and you have, not just one, but two valuable perspectives, at least from which to kind of talk about, just navigating death, not as something far away, but as something that's close, potentially, in various ways, whether close to you or just something that you are seeing up close. And, the home hospice sections, especially near the end of the book, really struck me as containing, wisdom and kind of well-earned or hard-earned kind of experience and even sort of serenity around that. And I would be curious to hear you just sort of talk more about your own navigation of that and the ways that, one part of your life and another intersected there.
Yeah, well, the irony of that is I thought, I know what it's like to fear death because I've helped people die, and not in terms of actually assisted them in their dying, but made them comfortable, done what I could to provide care that made them leaving this earth as pain-free and as easy as possible. And I've taken care of dead bodies. I've talked with families about death. I've called the medical examiner. I'm so familiar with death, and in a way that people used to be 100 years ago, but is unusual now. But this probably should have been obvious, but wasn't. Thinking about my own death was a whole different world. And I used to say, working in hospice, well, it's about the cycle of life. And I remember doing an interview a little bit after I was diagnosed, and the interviewer said, well, how do you feel about that now? And I thought I was going to start crying because it's not easy to talk about the cycle of life when it's your life on the line. So that was another realization of the gap between what my patients were feeling and fearing and what I was feeling and fearing. And I did have to take a leave. And in healing, I talk about this, how I felt so bad about that in the moment. I really felt like a failure. because I knew people who worked through cancer diagnoses, worked through treatment, and it could be because they had to financially, it could be because that made their life meaningful and they wanted to do that. There could be all kinds of reasons why people made that choice. But I felt like I can't do this. I just felt like I would be useless to people, that every issue would just have me worrying about, am I going to die? Which is, you can't do that if you're taking care of someone else, right? They're not there to take care of you. So that was hard. And I did take a leave. And then when I came back, as I said, I understood much more what was going on with people. And there's a story in healing called 2 Afternoons in Hospice. And a friend of mine who, when she looked at the book, she said, "Oh my God, that chapter title is so depressing." I said, "No, actually, I actually find it a very uplifting chapter about visiting a family." And it was an Orthodox Jewish woman here in Pittsburgh, probably about my age, whose father was dying. And I visited her 2 days in a row. And at the end of my visits, there wasn't that much for me to do clinically. And I just sat in a chair and she and I talked. We talked about her son getting a driver's license. We talked about the house they lived in. We talked about her husband's job. We just talked. And before I had had cancer, I would have thought that was an absolute waste of time. I wasn't doing anything clinically. What am I doing here? I mean, I would have been hard on myself if I had done that. But after being diagnosed, it felt so important. It felt like the most important thing that I did, that getting him the pain medication he needed, which was also very complicated. Okay, yeah, that matters. But saying indirectly to this woman, "You are more than the daughter of a dying father. You are a human being. I see that. And in that, I acknowledge your humanity and his humanity and the humanity of everyone who lives in this house." That felt so primary in a way I never would have seen if I had not had cancer.
Okay, I want to go to some of our questions now, and there's one that I'm going to roll in with the last question I wanted to ask you. So we have an anonymous attendee who asks, because you've been writing for a while, were you able to start writing right away, or did you need time to reflect? And I want to combine that with a question I wanted to ask, which is about how your background as a PhD in English literature informs your kind of interpretation and kind of narrative of this experience.
Yeah, interesting question. Well, I'm not sure if I hadn't had a background in English, if I could have used the structure that I used with these alternating chapters between being a nurse and being a patient, sometimes putting them together. I'm not sure I would have felt like, oh yeah, you can write a book that way. I think I would have had a feeling of like, this needs to be a very linear narrative that starts at one point and ends at another. So because of all the reading I've done, and my dissertation area was in 20th century American, so a lot of modern literature, I just had a comfort with that idea that you can make a story out of pieces that seem to not fit together, but they do. Along with that, I had the weird situation of not always knowing which piece was going to come when or where. And I had to take a lot on faith that I could figure that out. But in answer to the question of the anonymous attendee, this is actually a funny story, because I felt so powerfully that I have to write a book about what happened, because for me, it was shocking to see how the healthcare system just is not there for people in an emotional way. Or as I said in the part I read, what's the body and what's the soul? We're great at bodies, really not so good at souls. And I really, really, really wanted to write this book, and tried one iteration of a proposal and then another. And I worked with a literary agent, and I turned in one more proposal, and basically she said, but nicely, like, this does not work. This is not a book proposal. It's just kind of, I don't know what it is. It's kind of a mess, but she said it nicely. But she said, Theresa, what the problem is, you're still slaying the dragon. And so astute, I had not gotten to a point with my diagnosis and my treatment that I could reflect on it. And then interestingly, we moved in Pittsburgh from one neighborhood to another. And so I spent a couple months, packing and getting rid of things and doing all the stuff you do when you move. New house, new study, sat down, was able to see the book. So yeah, it was definitely a process. No one should think, oh, this was, easy for her. She got cancer and then wrote a book about it. No, there was definite healing that had to be done before I could even figure out what I wanted to write.
We have a few questions about providing compassionate medicine and what it means to provide compassionate medicine. And I'll try to kind of combine them together. Do you think that nurses bear a special burden in providing compassionate medicine? And what about other roles such as doctors or clinical social workers? And how are those related to each other? Would be kind of one part of that question. And then I think another kind of related question from the same person is about mistakes as a care provider. And if your own perspective on that has shifted.
Yeah, let me take the compassion one first. There was a study I write about in Healing where they asked patients to come up with their definition of compassion. What is compassionate care? And it was all the things we would imagine, that you feel like someone's extending themselves to you, that they're actually interested in what's going on with you. The kind of word that came out of this, and I bring it up because I actually love this word, but the word was supererogatory, which basically means, I just love saying it, but basically it means above and beyond. They really liked people who went above and beyond. To them, that was compassion. But so that's problematic, right? Especially in terms of the question you asked me earlier about feeling like you have to move heaven and earth for the patient. You have to go above and beyond. So did they mean move heaven and earth, go above and beyond, or did they mean someone who pushed enough against the system that they made it work for that patient? So, for example, getting to the question about nurses, I worked with nurses who would sometimes bring patients gifts, who would give patients their home phone number, who would be Facebook friends with patients. And I found all that problematic, even though it's extremely kind, right? But I felt like there have to be limits on our connections with patients. You can't have your job become your life. But I think there is a way that nurses feel like that is expected of us. I mean, one patient, even a nurse, took home his clothes and washed his clothing for him, which, again, incredibly nice, but couldn't the hospital do something like that? So I think nurses often have an expectation of having to do something extra. And it will even come out with patients, that call you and, oh, my lunch is cold. And then out in the hallway, the nurse will say, am I a waitress now? But it's not really always clear what our role is, or it's not clear how to call dietary and say, oh, I'm a vegetarian and you just gave me meatloaf, or, whatever the issue is. So I think it's a problem, can be a problem with our training. If people are trained and told, treat every patient as if it's your mother or your father, that right there to me is a recipe for expecting nurses to have to do more than the job might require. But if we look at it as professionalism, and can we create a system where just getting things to work does not require going above and beyond, that would be fabulous. It's kind of a complicated answer, but to me, it's a complicated situation, right? Because you want to help people, but again, you don't want to have to set yourself on fire to do that. And then with mistakes, that is such a potent topic right now, because did you hear about this nurse, Redonda Vaught in Tennessee? Yeah, who was just convicted of negligent homicide. And I've talked with people who see both sides of that. Some people who say the mistake she made is just hard to imagine anyone making that mistake because of quick version of the story. She was supposed to get out an anti-anxiety drug and accidentally got out a paralytic. And the anti-anxiety drug started with VE and the paralytic also started with VE. She hit a computer override. You only had to type in 2 letters of the drug for the override to work. The machine gave her the vecuronium, the paralyzing drug, instead of the anti-anxiety drug. So the people who say, how could she have made this mistake, talk about the number of overrides, the fact that the drug comes with a label on it that says paralyzing agent, the fact that it's not liquid and you have to reconstitute it. So at some point, wouldn't she stop and think, wow, this is not how I give drugs like Ativan and the other anti-anxiety drugs. How could someone make this mistake? On the other side, people say she had volunteered to go work on a floor she wasn't familiar with. She had a student with her, and the student was distracting her. She was overworked. She didn't know the system. And as soon as she realized her mistake, she admitted it. And this is what I see as the most important piece. So we could sit here and we could go back and forth. She should have known it was vecuronium. She was overworked. Just imagine yourself in her shoes. I mean, I think both points have legitimacy, but what really matters is now a nurse on the job made a mistake. Patient ended up dying. I hadn't said that before. The patient did end up dying, and she is probably going to go to jail. So the ripple effects of that on people in healthcare are terrible. And just the other day, I got my second COVID booster, and my pharmacist spent 10 minutes just talking to me about the anxiety he has now because of this ruling. And he said, we're so short-staffed. And this is someone working at a commercial pharmacy, right? Not someone even working in a hospital, but we're so short-staffed. It's so easy to make a mistake like that. So I don't really know what's going on. That DA in Tennessee was very careful to say, this is not about nurses, this is about this nurse. But all of the nurses feel like, no, this is about nurses, whether you think it's about nurses or not. So I thought we were moving more toward a system of what's called just culture, where if someone owns up to a mistake and admits it, they're not punished. I hate to use that word, but apparently, I mean, in this case, that didn't happen. The nurse lost her job, lost her license, which I would not argue with, but the jail time is a whole another level. It just doesn't happen with healthcare workers. And I find it just very strange coming on the heels of COVID when we know how overworked everyone was. And there's lots of theories. She was at Vanderbilt Medical Center, what was going on there, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't want to re-litigate that. It's more important to think about this cannot be a new standard that's set for healthcare workers. It's so unsafe to create a system where people have an extremely strong disincentive to admit when they make a mistake, because much as people like to say they don't make mistakes, everybody makes mistakes. I mean, do you make mistakes in your job? Like, everybody makes mistakes.
Yeah, all the time. Lives aren't on the line. Students.
Yeah, right. So, right. And then you create a system that's safer, right? You never have that someone can get a drug out by typing in 2 letters of the drug's name. That's just dumb. Another long answer, but it's complicated. And that case has been such a big deal.
Yeah, the questioner actually alluded to that case in their question.
Okay.
So I think we have time maybe for one more question. So I'm going to combine a couple others. We have one question about what were the kind of most important factors that contributed to your healing, and if there was a moment when you felt like you crossed a threshold to reach healing. And then another question about the place of art and spirituality in your examination of healing. And this person knows that you like the Wim Wenders film, Wings of Desire. Yes. And so kind of alludes to that. And so I thought maybe you could try to kind of take those together.
Yeah, those are good questions. It's interesting. I grew up going to church and then haven't for a long time. And then I went back for a while after I was done with treatment, and I still kind of feel the pull to do that. And well, then we had a pandemic, so it got more complicated. But that's one thing I didn't expect, to suddenly find an interest in spirituality that took the form of, oh, I want to go back to church. Raised Episcopalian, if that matters to anyone. So that surprised me a lot. Question about when did I feel healed that's a really good question. And I can actually define that in a very precise way, but it was pretty recent. So in December, Thanksgiving weekend, my husband and I and two friends of ours went to Arizona and hiked to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, spent a couple nights and hiked back up. And that was the moment when I got to the top again that I felt like, okay, I'm not just a cancer patient anymore. And I had seriously been very concerned I would not be able to do this hike. I made my husband promise me that no matter how slow I was on the way up, he would stay with me. I like found out, like, can you get a mule to take you if you just can't walk anymore? I mean, I was really worried about it. And I even told a friend of mine, and she said, well, what are you worried about? And I said that I'm going to have to get light flighted out of the Grand Canyon. And she started laughing. And she said, and this is someone I work out with, and she said, I can guarantee you that is not going to happen. But I think I so much had that sense of being a kind of diminished person. And, you know, I don't think everyone like has to hike down into and then up out of the Grand Canyon to feel like they're not a cancer patient anymore. But that was such a profound feeling of, wow, okay, wow, yeah, okay, here I am again.
And in winter too. I mean, Grand Canyon is cold in winter.
Yeah. Well, people may not know, but there's Phantom Ranch. There's some cabins down there. And so it gets cold at night, but it was just amazingly beautiful during the day. And there are actually hot showers. It was wonderful, a really transformative experience, just beautiful, and all the things you would expect. It was all that.
Well, that's maybe a good note for us to end on. Thank you for such a humane book, and for your wisdom about, topics great and small connected to healthcare and hiking and healing and everything.
Well, and thanks for being a great interlocutor. Another long word that's fun to say.
All right. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. Thank you for everyone who tuned in. I posted some links in the chat, but I'll post another one just because you want to get Theresa and Gabe's book when you're checking out. But you can find both books, Healing When a Nurse Becomes a Patient and The Next Shift. You can find them both at Powell's in the store or online. Thank you both for joining us, and then stay tuned for more future events. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.